Hanukkah is one of the most popular holidays of the Jewish calendar year. They say that Hanukkah, like Passover, is celebrated in the home, and maybe that's the reason for its staying power. It's also a beautiful holiday, lighting candles. What could go wrong? And sure enough, it is a beautiful holiday, but we're going to see that within Hanukkah is embedded some of the deepest ideas of Jewish spirituality. And also, the story of Hanukkah is a story of Jewish strength and Jewish survival and Jewish thriving and Jewish peoplehood. So let's start with the history. We have to go back to the setting of the Hanukkah story, which will begin with the Greek conquering of the Middle East, and particularly of the land of Israel, by none other than Alexander the Great. Here is a mosaic from Pompeii depicting him. Uh, Alexander was very young when he conquered what was back then most of the civilized world. And at the time, the Jewish people were uh, living in the land, which is, if you think about it, a crossroads to three continents. So it's not surprising that the land of Israel would be overrun time and time again by the most significant of empires. And yet we're going to see there's a very interesting story that when Alexander came to Jerusalem, Simon the high priest came out to greet him. Now, the way the Greeks conquered and held their empire is going to be very important for the Hanukkah story. And the way they consolidated their power was through a systematic program of exporting their culture, or what is called Hellenization. If your host people become Hellenized, they'll identify with the empire and you won't have trouble holding on to it. So they would export their culture. So when Simon the high priest came out to Alexander to represent the Jews, he offered him uh, he offered him the outlook that the Jewish people would take, the position they would take, which would be to subject to Alexander's rule without fighting. Yet, most importantly, they requested that there be no idols placed in the temple and that we be allowed to lead our religious lives. And sure enough, Alexander agreed to this. And the custom is, the tradition is that the Jews named their sons after Alexander because he was a benevolent emperor. And to this day, there are Jews with the Hebrew name Alexander. Now, if you look in between that time, which was 330 BCE, and today's times, you don't see a lot of Alexanders. And the contemporary Alexanders really come from Tsar Alexander II, who was one of the only czars who was somewhat better to the Jews. And so the practice was rekindled, was reinstated. And there are people to this day, their Hebrew name, they're called up to the Torah with the name Alexander. But the backstory of the encounter between Alexander and Simon the high priest is in the Talmud and in the Midrash. Here you have a mosaic from the synagogue in Hukok from the 5th century. So granted, this is centuries later, but Jody Magnus, the professor who excavated it, believes that this is a representation of the encounter of Alexander on the right with his legions and his elephants, and Simon Shimon HaTzadik, who was high priest, who would have been dressed in white as the Kohanim were. And the Midrash tells us, the Talmud, that Alexander, upon seeing him, got off his horse and bowed down to him. And his entourage said, "Sir, what are you doing? You're bowing down to this Jew." And he said to them, "When I went out to battle, I would see his face, and I knew that he had something to do with my victory." Now, the way it's understood is that at that time in history, there was a shift. And the shift was from a more experiential religious experience when Jews had prophecy and the rest of the world was involved in idolatry or trying to connect with other energies in the universe. And at this point was a shift to the age of wisdom. And so actually it's the beginning of the period of the Talmud, and for the rest of the world, it will be the beginning of the spreading of Greek wisdom. And there's this idea of an idea whose time has come, that God sometimes brings about changes that will be going on in different cultures, sometimes separate cultures at the same time. And so that's what this represents. That God's plan was to bring about this change towards wisdom, which will develop a new modality for the Jewish people, an emphasis upon wisdom and Torah study. Now, as we get closer to the Chanukah story, we see that it happened a bit over 150 years after Alexander's conquest. So what was happening during that time? When Alexander died, his empire was divided up, and in the Middle East, most significantly between the Seleucids, who were Syrian Greeks, and the Ptolemaic Empire, who were Egyptian Greeks. Cleopatra actually wasn't Greek; she was Egyptian. So, well, she was born in Greece but lived in Egypt. So, during most of that period, from 301 until 200, for that century, the Ptolemies ruled Israel from Egypt. And they did not aggressively promote the Hellenism, and they kept to the status quo of not introducing idols into the temple. And then things changed. In the year 200, the Syrian Greeks conquered Israel, and a more aggressive program of Hellenization was begun. And that will be what's called a Kulturkampf, a culture war. And part of the complexity of it was that the more upper class Jews identified with the greater culture and themselves started to push that agenda. And so you had a lot of conflict and a lot of tension, especially after the position of high priest was bought at a price by a Jew named Jason, and he pushed the Hellenization even further. Now, part of this culture war was the incongruity, the conflict between the Greek outlook and the Jewish outlook. And the Greek culture celebrated the physical, the material, the physical body. And remember, Seleucid Greece was not high Greece of Plato and Socrates. It was a second-hand, hundreds of years later, a more popular and more materialistic and hedonistic culture. And so perhaps the difference in outlooks can be summed up by the teaching of Rabbi Judah in Ethics of the Fathers, who said, don't look at the container, but look at what is in it. The Greeks focused on the container, upon the visuals, upon beauty, upon heroism, the individual, the glory of the individual. And Jewish values focused upon internal qualities, upon humility, and upon spiritual values. So what did Jason do when he bribed his way in to be high priest? He built a gymnasium at the base of the temple in Jerusalem. And so the young Kohanim, who were supposed to be training in the temple, would run down the hill and go to the gymnasium. Now, the gymnasium was a place where you did athletics in the naked. And it says that the Greek way of life caught on very quickly. This is from the book of Maccabees. The books of Maccabees do not appear in the Hebrew Bible, and they were lost for the Jewish people for a number of hundreds of centuries. And they are, however, included in the New Testament between the time of the Old and the New Testament. In fact, that's where they fall. It's known as the Apocrypha. So we look at them as historical sources we can draw from, but not necessarily as authoritative Jewish books. Yet they paint the picture where it says the adoption of foreign customs increased because of Jason, an exceedingly wicked and ungodly man who was no high priest. This caused a lot of tension amongst the Jewish populace. The Jews were incensed because Jason took the bribery money from the coffers of the temple itself, and the Jews rioted. The Greeks suppressed it. Jews were killed. They pushed back, and the Greeks then understood the only way to subjugate the Jews is hit them where it hurts, which was in their religious lives. And that's where the religious decrees began. The Greeks did not set out systematically to wipe out Judaism, but it was a result of political unrest and of Jews pushing the cultural agenda. And so you had a showdown, and the Greeks outlawed the Shabbat, circumcision, the new month. The traditional Jews, and most notably a family of Mattathias, the high priest, and his 5 sons, who were all Kohanim, fled into the mountains. And what did the Greeks do when the traditional Jews fled to the mountains to continue religious life? They pursued them. And they would gather people in the town. They would force the leader to bow down in front of an idol or eat pork. And when they came to Modin, the town of the Maccabees, instead of succumbing, they gathered in the center of town and pulled their swords out from under their garments and killed the Greek soldiers and fled further into the mountains. And then they sent out the word, "Who is with God, come to me." Eventually, they will gather an army of 10,000 people. They will train, because remember, these were Kohanim. These were the Jews from the city who were involved in Torah study, not in farming or outdoor activities. And so they trained, and Judah Maccabee wound up becoming a great, brilliant general. And so their army would rout the Seleucid troops of 40, 50,000 person armies. And after a series of dramatic victories, through ambushes and guerrilla warfare, the Jews were successful in retaking the temple. And here you have on the left a battle scene with the elephants. Eleazar, one of the 5 brothers, Maccabee brothers, went to take down the elephant with its soft underbelly, and the book of Maccabees says the elephant fell upon him. Here we have on the right Mattatyahu, calling out, rousing the Jews to rebel against Antiochus. And eventually they will, in the year 165, they will successfully retake Jerusalem. And here we come to the actual Hanukkah event itself, the famous story of the menorah, because the Greeks had desecrated the temple in Jerusalem, and the Maccabees set out to rededicate it, and that's what Chanukah means. And they rededicated it. They purified the stones of the altar, and they also set up the menorah. Now, to light the menorah, you needed pure oil, which had not come into contact with the dead body. They found one flask which was sealed, which had remained pure, and it would take another week to get another batch of pure oil. So they lit the oil, and as we know the story, the oil burned for 8 days instead of 1 day. And so this miracle occurred, and the temple was rededicated, and it was a great time of celebration for the Jewish people, and that celebration was established for all of posterity till this very day. Now, what's so noteworthy is, and has to be pointed out, is that the menorah was not vital to rededicate the temple. So why do we make such a big deal about it? Why did God perform a miracle through it? So one understanding is the miracle of the oil was really telling the Jews that their military battle was also a miracle. Not a miracle like the oil beyond the laws of nature, but a miracle working within the laws of nature. And so really Hanukkah is a celebration of the military victory, but we don't celebrate when the war ended. The war would go on for another 20 years. 4 out of the 5 Maccabee sons would die, but we celebrate the taking of Jerusalem because we were fighting for our religious beliefs. We were fighting for the right to practice our religion and our Torah, and that's what we live for. And we don't glorify the military battle. Yet at the same time, Judaism believes that it is a partnership, that we are partners with God. We have to make our efforts. We have to go out to war. We have to fight our battles. We don't rely on God's miracles. And yet we believe God helps us through history. And we've seen that in the last 2 years in Israel, the incredible turnaround, bringing down our enemies who are around us, and the miracles should continue. And the posterity of Hanukkah lives on. This is a recreation of the menorah, which you can find in Jerusalem in the Old City. The holiday was established, and Jewish life was rekindled, to use the analogy from our theme of our holiday. Now, the Maccabee family, it's not clear what the word Maccabee means. It might mean hammer, Hebrew hammer. It might be a praise of God. The name of the family was called the Hashmonaim. And the sad reality of the unfolding of the story was, and here you see the tombs of the Maccabees in the town of Modi'in. To the left is what was thought to be the tomb, although today most archaeologists believe that is a Byzantine tomb, and the site on the right is actually where the tombs might have been. But the sad part is that the future Maccabee kings would themselves become more Hellenized, so to speak. And as is often the case, the rebels become the establishment, and tragically their line ended after about 100 years. And there are different explanations given for that. Nachmanides points out that they were Kohanim who were not supposed to become kings. And Shimon, the last of the living brothers, was reluctant to, but he was kind of pushed into it by the people who wanted him to become king. And so we have the history of the story of Hanukkah. Now let's focus upon the theme of the menorah and the light itself. And to do that, we start with the Midrash, and we start with the beginning of Genesis. The Midrash, the rabbinic teaching, goes on the verse in Genesis, and it says, darkness was on the face of the deep. They say, what is that darkness? This is the darkness of the exile of Greece, who darkened the vision of the Jewish people. And it's considered to be darkness because it is a culture that is material, a culture that worships the physical, a culture that doesn't delve into the next verse, let there be light, which is the spiritual light. And light was the first element to be created. And we're going to focus on that for a minute, because the light is what pushes off the darkness. So what is that light? Let's try to understand it. So the inception of creation. The Zohar is going to tell us about the beginning of creation, about the creation of light. And it said, when the hidden one, who is God, began to create, he made a singular point, and from that, everything came. The whole structure and the unfolding of the rest of the world. And the secret of it is the radiance. Now, the word radiance is actually Zohar. The Zohar is the primary, in this text, is the primary teachings repository of Kabbalistic teachings. It's a commentary on the Torah, but the word itself means radiance, the book of radiance. And it says, from that original light, all the utterances of creation came about in the secret of the expansion of that point. Now, if you think about it, what does this sound like? All came from one point. It came from energy, and it radiated out and expanded. Indeed, it sounds like Big Bang. And we're going to see that Nachmanides, the medieval philosopher, even more so, has a description of this process and a parallel to the Big Bang. And it says that in the instant following creation, all the matter of the universe was concentrated in one spot. So all of creation happened at that one moment. It says no larger than a grain of mustard. And Big Bang is that all of the matter of the universe was in one location. It started off as pure energy, and it had potential, he says, to gain substance and form, and that expanded and then became the universe. So how did the Kabbalists know about Big Bang theory in the 13th century? So this is one of the foundations on which we understand the Kabbalah being a teachings that come from above, that come from a higher source. So the Kabbalistic masters would receive revelations of this knowledge. According to tradition, it goes back to Abraham and perhaps even to Adam, to the beginning of creation. And it's one of the foundations that shows us the truth and the depth of the Kabbalistic teachings. So to draw from modern science again, the Torah tells us that the first thing created was light. Nachmanides says in the Zohar that all matter came into the world at that first moment. How could that be? So we know from Einstein that E equals mc squared. Energy has an equivalence with matter times the speed of light squared. What does that mean? It means that matter is really congealed or compressed energy. And sure enough, that's how these ideas brought about nuclear technology as well, which is unleashing the incredible amount of energy in matter. It's also noteworthy to point out that the speed of light is the number that through which that transference can be calculated. And the only constant in the universe is the speed of light. And sure enough, according to the Torah, it's the first thing to be created. It's the building block upon which everything else, all matter, and the only constant was created. So we see these incredible parallels between the Torah's depth of understanding of creation and modern science. Now, we have a paradox in the book of Genesis because it tells us when was light created. So God said, let there be light on the first day. Yet, the planets were not created until the fourth day. So if there was no sun, what was this light? So the Talmud tells us that this light of creation was not that of the sun, but a different kind of light, through which man could observe from one end of the world to the other. So this light was a light of understanding, as we use the term enlightenment. And we use light as a metaphor for clarity, for seeing, for understanding. But it says, because God saw that people would misuse this light, he didn't want the wicked to use it, so he hid it from them. And for who did he hide it? For the righteous people in the world to come, in the future world. So this original light was a semi-physical, semi-spiritual light. And the physical existence at that time was a blending, was a harmony between the spiritual and the physical. That light was hidden away, and then the light that was revealed was the light of the sun. on the fourth day. But we're told, the good news is, that even though light was hidden away, the Zohar tells us, it wasn't completely hidden. And it says every single day a ray of that light shines into the world, keeping everything alive. With that ray, God feeds the world. So that light sustains the world, physically and spiritually. And it says Torah study can bring down that light. And so the Hasidic masters in the Kabbalah tells us, then when we light the menorah, what are we doing? We're retapping into the divine presence in the temple, and we're tapping into that original light of creation, that original light of pure spirituality. How do we see that? So the Midrash tells us that the light was not concealed to Adam until after the first Shabbat. The rabbinic tradition is that the transgression of the Garden of Eden, of eating from the fruit, happened before Shabbat, but God held back, and for the 12 hours before Shabbat and the 24 hours of Shabbat, the light was there for 36 hours. And then it was hidden. So how many candles are there in the menorah? If you count up all the candles for all the nights, not including the Shamas, not including the ninth candle, which is not really one of the Hanukkah candles, it's there to light the others and to use, so we have light that we can see by. If you count up all the candles, it's 36 Hanukkah lights, corresponding to the 36 hours of that divine light. And so we see that the Hanukkah menorah is channeling that divine light. And if we sit with the candles and look into the light, we can perhaps grasp an inkling of what that eternal light is about. And it says that the light of God is the soul of man, and that light can awaken our soul and penetrate into our soul. And so that's what we're trying to do on Hanukkah. We're trying to awaken and connect to the light and to the light within our soul. And if we do so, it says in the Talmud, we read it before, here it is again, that with that light, you can see from one end of the world to the other. And we know they're great spiritual figures who know things about people, about what's in the world, what's channel blessings in the world, and who are accessing that light. And the Torah is our guidebook of how to access the light, the Or Ein Sof, the light of the eternal light. And so we turn in the miracle of Hanukkah and we sit with the lights. We not just enjoy the beauty of the lights, but we connect to the spiritual light of the holiday. And we're told also in the Midrash, Ephraim Paltanov shared this Midrash, and I'd like to share it with you. It's very beautiful. It says, the Jewish people said to the Holy One, we made a menorah in the times of Moshe, and it was extinguished. We made for you a menorah in the times of Solomon, and it was extinguished. And they'd say, from now on, we await only your light. So what is that light? That is the light of Mashiach. That is the light that God hid away with the original creation. And at that time, we will no longer have a world where we struggle between the physical and the spiritual. We'll no longer have a world where our sight is dimmed, but we will flourish in the light of Mashiach, the light of God, and the light that we channel through the menorah.